Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Paul, and he's going to be telling us all about some apples and botany and cider.
All right. Well, thanks, Ben. Happy to be here. Paul Whitaker is my name. I'm a professor of biology at the UW-SP campus in Wausau, formerly UW-MC. I am a botany professor, or basically biology professor, and I'm a hobbyist when it comes to apples. Other than a more or less untended tree in my neighbor's yard when I was growing up as a kid, I really had not had much experience or direct exposure to apple trees. Obviously, I loved apples, ate apples, looked forward to fall and all the variety of apples that brings. But it wasn't until I moved to Wausau to take this position that I actually had some apple trees of my own to take care of. My PhD project at UW-Madison was in insect biology, insects in an organic apple orchard in southwest Wisconsin. And so I was hired to my position here in Wausau before I had finished my doctorate or finished my dissertation. And so when I finally did finish it, my wife celebrated by buying me a little hand crank cider press. And so we were able to put that to use on many of the apples that came out of our backyard orchard. And since then, I've continued to add trees to that orchard. So you can see in this picture, this cornucopia of apples, it turns out that there is incredible genetic diversity in apples, much more so than probably any other food crop that people consume. And a lot of that diversity, well, I would say a representation of that diversity is kept in terms of single trees of different types of apples grown at the Cornell, the Geneva Apple Collection that's maintained by the USDA and on the Cornell campus in New York. And you can see the variety of apples, sizes, shapes, colors, and you can only imagine the diverse tastes and textures in these fruits, but the trees themselves vary greatly as well. So this is a picture of a marketplace in a town called Almaty in a country called Kazakhstan that is central to the story that we'll be looking at today. And I challenge you to come up with any other crop, any other type of produce where consumers have so many different types of named varieties to choose from in the marketplace. So this marketplace, you can see all different colors and shapes and sizes of apples. In this marketplace, this is very close to the ancestral homeland of apples. And there are forests in the mountains in this area where the major overstory tree, the major tree in the forest, is apples. And almost every apple in that forest is different in color, size, shape. And so in this marketplace, the vendors will actually entice people to buy some of their apples by slicing off pieces and feeding them to them because they might not be recognized named varieties. But for us, we can go to the market and we can find Honeycrisp or Pink Lady, Golden Delicious, Macintosh, Braeburn, Gala, Fuji, carrots, celery, grapefruits, oranges. None of those have that kind of name recognition. And it's not just names, but people have favorites or preferences for different uses of these. So where does this come from? Well, this unusually high genetic diversity that apples have in part stems back to its long history. And the first bullet point here, no periods of genetic bottlenecks. And I'll come back to that. But there are a number of animal species that have been driven very close to extinction, very small numbers of surviving animals. And then conservation efforts manage to bring them back, build those populations back up. But when you start from a very small population, for example, the California condors, when the last surviving animals were brought into captivity to do captive breeding and try to bring them back, I think there were only like 27 animals left. So there's not a lot of genetic diversity in a small number of animals. Apples have never had that very small population size. So they've had a long time to build up genetic diversity. An individual apple tree can live for a long time. 100 years is not unheard of. And it turns out that apple flowers are self-incompatible. And what that means is if you have a lone apple tree, if you were out on a desert island with a single apple tree, you probably would get no apples because the flowers need pollen from a genetically different plant in order to set fruit. So what that means is instead of inbreeding, they have to cross with other genetically different individuals, and that means that you get genetically diverse offspring. And finally, desirable trees with fruit that's tasty, that's crisp, that ripens at the right time, and the right time might depend on who you're asking to eat those apples. Apple eaters continually pick out the best trees, best meaning best eating, and certainly the trees that have survived diseases and insects and droughts and winter and all of those kinds of things. But selection of apples, and a lot of apple eaters, other than people probably, so bears and deer and horses and other kinds of animals, probably eat the whole fruit, and then they wander away from that parent tree and they poop out the undigested remains, which often includes viable seeds. And those seeds are more likely to germinate and grow into a mature tree after passing through an animal's digestive tract than they would without that. So I've sketched out here a picture of a flower, of an apple flower. And what you can see there on the bottom right, 2 ovules per chamber and a 5-chambered ovary, that's part of the flower. The ovary is the part of the flower that will develop into the apple. And so that's why you don't see different kinds of apples on a tree, even if the pollen is coming from different places, because that ovary is part of the parent tree. It's not changed by the pollination so that the fruit characteristic changes. So, and every pollen grain that lands on the stigma, the pollen landing pad of the flower, that will deliver sperm to 1 egg in 1 ovule. And so every seed, the ovules turn into seeds, every seed is the result of a different act of sexual reproduction, where a different sperm and a different egg have created a genetically different offspring. So inside that apple, you can kind of think of an apple, a ripe apple with seeds inside, as a pregnant mother, and in much the same way that a pregnant mother, other than showing the signs of pregnancy, does not really change based on the on who the identity of the father of that child, right? The child is the one that's affected by the genetics of the father. The mother is not. The same way the apple is genetically part of that parent tree, but it's the seeds inside that are changed by that sexual reproduction. So the function of sex in biology is to create genetically different offspring. And this happens by combining genetic material from a male parent with genetic material from a female parent. And it surprises people that don't know much about botany, but plants have sperm and eggs in the same way that animals do. The picture on the left here is, I was participating in a potato breeding project as a backyard gardener. And these are 8 different potatoes that all grew from seeds, actual, put seed in a dirt and it grows into a plant. Seeds that had the same grandparents. So what you can see is different sizes, different shapes, different degrees of cracking, different flesh colors, different skin colors. They differed in the number of potatoes, the vigor of the plants. And the same is true, the right-hand picture is the same. This is a cross between 2 different apple parents, a cross-pollination of 2 different kinds of apples. And each one of those apples held in the hands here is the fruit from a different offspring, from a different seed from the same apple that resulted from that cross. So with this genetic diversity, not all of these apples, not all of those potatoes are worth keeping, worth growing, worth repeating. But every once in a while, in the genetic roll of the dice, a delicious, productive, environmentally tolerant apple emerges from this sexual reproduction roll of the dice. And we might call that a good apple, right? Something that's worth growing in an orchard and potentially marketing. So how do we get good apples? Well, for the most part, they come about through apple sex, right? Cross-pollination of 2 different kinds of apples. And this might just happen in the wild, right? So in those forests in Kazakhstan, in the mountains, in farm fields or roadsides, right? Cross-pollination happens, an animal eats the fruit, the seeds get dropped on the soil, they grow up, and just by chance, there's a delicious, wonderful apple that makes its way to the marketplace. And as examples of this, Granny Smith emerged that way. The original red delicious apple emerged that way. I think the Jonathan apple emerged that way. So some named varieties have come about not through intentional plant breeding by agricultural scientists, but just through random chance. But plant breeders also get involved. And so plant breeders can pick two parents, good apples that have good characteristics and might make intriguing offspring. And so we call that plant breeding. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then finally, there's a third way that good apples might arise. And this is through mutation that happens, a change in the DNA. And horticulture people call these things sports, which is kind of an interesting name. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, but we'll talk about that as well. So this is almost like that picture of the potatoes and the apples. This is the result of a breeding project. So not just seeds from a single apple, because a single apple will typically have probably no more than 10 seeds on it. But if you're doing plant breeding, say between Golden Delicious and Jonathan, right, two different apples, you would take pollen from one of the trees and put it on the stigma, on the pollen landing pad of flowers of the other tree. And you would do that multiple times because you want to have lots of examples of the mixture of genetics and see, what are the good apples worth keeping. So these are the results of one cross of that sort. All of these would have had the same two parents. Grow those apples, all of which would look the same, right? Cut them open, take the seeds out, germinate them, grow them up until they fruit, and you get all of these different varieties of sizes and shapes and colors and textures and hardiness and variety of things. So really, really incredible genetic diversity that exists in apples. So where did wild apples come from, and the wild apple sex that generated a lot of this genetic diversity? Well, as best as we can tell, the apples that we recognize as domesticated apples originated in a mountain range called the Tian Shan, which is sort of the western part of China, sandwiched in between some of the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia. And this is a mountain range that stretches about 1,600 miles from east to west. And interestingly, it's bordered on the north side by steppe, which is kind of a dry, short grass prairie. And on the south and on the east, it's bordered by the deserts. I can never remember the name of this, the Taklaman Desert, I think, on the south, that big flat area that you can see under the label A there in the middle of the map, and the Gobi Desert on the right. So what you have here is almost like a landlocked island. Mountains tend to accumulate precipitation, snowcap that runs down and waters the lower elevations. And this area is located not far from the Indian Ocean, far enough, but close enough that those warm ocean breezes, that warm wind that comes in, has really kept this area from being glaciated during the ice ages that covered a lot of Europe, a lot of northern Asia, and a lot of North America over a long time. So these mountains have been in existence for a long time. Apples have been in those forests for a long time. And mountains have a lot of elevational change, right? There's highlands, there's lowlands, there's mid-range, there's valleys. And so there's a lot of diverse habitat in there. And so organisms that live in a place with a lot of vertical relief like that have a lot of different habitats to kind of experiment and have different genetic components or different genetic identities of individuals in that species adapting to different parts of that environment. So there are forests in part of these mountains. The highest mountains, some of them go up to 24,000 feet, so they're snow-capped, much like the Himalayas. But lower mountain ranges are forested with a mix of deciduous broadleaf forests and conifer forests. The forests have a diversity of wildlife, including bears and deer and elk and other kinds of plant-feeding animals. The deserts sort of isolate this, so the apples had to kind of do their thing in this mountain range for a long time. And bears are hibernating animals that need a lot of calories late in the summer, early fall to build up the fat reserves for hibernation. And it turns out that's exactly the time that apples are ripening. So it's thought that bears play a really significant role in choosing apples that were particularly tasty and juicy and high in sugars and carbohydrates, and then dispersing those seeds around the mountain ranges, because the worst place for a plant to germinate and grow is right in the shade of its parent plant. So flowering plants that produce seeds within fruits very often depend on animals to move those babies, right? Because every seed has a baby plant in it. Every apple has maybe 10 baby apple trees in it, all genetically different, and they depend on animals to move them around. So later on, horses began to be domesticated, and wild horses were native to the steppe regions north of these mountain ranges. It's thought that the wild horses probably didn't wander into the forests to eat apples frequently because there would be predators in there. There would be wolves and bears and other things that might attack the horses. But occasionally, especially during those ice ages, the steppe started to dry out and there would not be a lot of food available in terms of browse on that grassland steppes, and the horses would occasionally wander in. Eventually, people domesticated those horses, and the long valleys that run east-west between the ridges of this Tian Shan mountain range served as important trade routes. And so at that point, then, horses would have picked up apples as they're wandering through and then deposited their seeds along that. The other important thing, if you know anything about early human civilizations seem to have popped up almost simultaneously in what's the Fertile Crescent of Iran and Iraq on the left-hand side of this map, and in China on the right-hand side of this map. The inhospitable, very dry deserts would have been easy traveling, but also very hot, very dry, and hard to support animals with watering holes and people with needs for water as well. And especially during the summertime, those long east-west valleys would have provided more comfortable traveling conditions for those trade routes that developed between China and the Middle East area. So you can see this whole combination of historical factors really helped apples develop a lot of that genetic diversity. And it turns out that's why, if you go to this region now, there are forests where you can find apples that are probably just about as attractive and delicious as many of the apples that we see in the supermarket today, which is really interesting to think about. Just a picture of a bear. So this is a bear in apple tree in an orchard in British Columbia, a brown bear, and a picture of bear poop on the right with chunks of apple and apple seeds. And so you can kind of imagine the impact of bears feeding on apples over millennia and how that would shape the genetic composition of apples. This is kind of an aside. As I was doing research for this talk, I came across a book reference. Apples are from Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the country where the Tian Shan is kind of on this boundary here between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And I thought, wow, that might be an interesting thing. Well, it turns out the only thing that this book has to do with apples is the author became acquainted with Kazakhstan by sitting next to somebody on an airplane who said apples are from Kazakhstan. And Christopher Robbins thought, Kazakhstan, where's that? And so he got very interested in it, and he wound up traveling extensively in Kazakhstan and meeting people. And so it's kind of a travelogue and ethnography of Kazakhstan. Very interesting read. Doesn't have much to do with apples other than the introductory story on it. But if you're interested, that's kind of a cool thing. Another kind of aside that's interesting. One of my other side projects is I'm involved in the Monk Botanical Gardens here in Wausau. And about 2 weeks ago, this summer, I spent a lot of time building a yurt. And Monk Botanical Gardens is just started this fall a nature preschool where the yurt is kind of the home base for the kids and the teachers, and they spend most of their days outside. So I was building a yurt, and then about 2 weeks ago, I was doing a workshop on apple cider production, apple cider pressing at the gardens. And I had my van sort of in between where I was doing the workshop and the yurt, and a couple came up to me and asked me to take their picture, and I said, well, sure. And the woman had a headscarf, and he said, we are from Kazakhstan, and we have never seen a yurt in the United States before. I'm like, this is too weird. I'm doing a workshop on apples. I have never met anyone from Kazakhstan, well, except for one other person in Wausau. And here we are between a yurt, which is originated, again, in Kazakhstan. A lot of traditional people historically lived in yurts. They were mobile tent structures. It was just kind of a weird synergy that happened that day. All right, so bears played a really important role in choosing good apples and moving the seeds around in the Tian Shan. Johnny Appleseed played the same function in North America. So when European settlers came to North America, they brought apple seeds with them. That was the most portable, survivable way of transporting a familiar food crop across the Atlantic Ocean. And as we've noted, when you plant apples from seed, you never know what you're going to get. You might get sweet apples, sour apples, bitter apples, big, small, early ripening, late ripening. But they brought apples, and they continued to select the best fruit. Johnny Appleseed was a believer in a religion called, or was a follower of a Swedenborgian faith, where I picture it almost as akin to Buddhism, right? Where you really don't want to harm any creature that you can help harming. And so Johnny Appleseed was known for walking around barefoot year-round, snow, summer, winter, whenever. But he was and in like the Disney version, he's kind of this little goofy crackpot guy. But it turns out he was a pretty shrewd businessman, and he took advantage of the fact that along the Ohio River, especially in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there were cider mills where people would bring their apples in and use the power of the rivers to grind the apples and press them into juice. And after you do that, you're left with all of the pulp and all of the seeds. And Johnny Appleseed would come to Pittsburgh, and he would sift through all of that apple pumice and pick out the seeds and fill gunny sacks, burlap sacks with these seeds. And then he would raft down the Ohio River past the point where settlers had expanded into the new Northwest territories along the Ohio River there. He would clear a patch of land, because that was all forested area, and he would plant his apple seeds. And he would have these just big groves of seedling apple trees and pear trees, mostly apples. And then as westward expansion continued, he had a ready market for people to buy those trees from him, because one of the requirements for settlers to get a land grant was to plant 50 or more apple trees. And that was built into the law to discourage speculation on land, right? So they didn't want people just taking a land grant, sitting on it for a little bit, and then selling it. If you were going to acquire a patch of forest and put in all of the effort to clear out the forest trees and purchase and tend to apple trees, it was pretty unlikely that you were going to be a short-term tenant on that land and sell it for a profit quickly. So the puritanical version of Johnny Appleseed is that he, is apple pies and apple cider and pure Americana. But it turns out that most of the apples that grew on these trees that Johnny Appleseed sold to settlers are called spitters, right? You take a bite and go, bah, spit it out. Good only for cider. So people would grow these apples, and they didn't have refrigeration or canning or food preserving. So they would either dry the good apples, or they would press all of them in and make cider. And without refrigeration or preservation, a lot of that cider would ferment and become hard cider. So kind of an interesting tale. If you're interested in that, the author Michael Pollan has a book called The Botany of Desire, and about a quarter of his book is on apples, and a lot of that centers on Johnny Appleseed. So that's a great story. Henry David Thoreau loved apples, loved wild apples, and so these are two quotes of his enjoyment of wild apples and some of that genetic diversity. Sour enough to set a squirrel's teeth on edge and to make a jay scream. That sounds like an apple that you'd want to eat, right? And this other quote's one of my favorites. There's a wild apple tree on Noshatuck Hill in my town, which has to me a peculiarly pleasant bitter tang, not perceived till it is 3/4 tasted. It remains on the tongue. As you eat it, it smells exactly like a squash bug. It's sort of a triumph to eat and relish it. Isn't that great? It's an accomplishment to eat an apple that tastes like a squash bug. All right, so that's a bit about wild apples, both in the Tian Shan and in the United States. Talk a little bit about sort of controlled apple sex, plant breeding. One of the trees that I've planted in my backyard is a disease-resistant apple called Enterprise, and the PRI in the name stands for Purdue, Rutgers, and Illinois, 3 universities that had a collaborative apple breeding program for many, many years. And what you can see here is the family tree, the pedigree of this apple tree that I have in my backyard. And the PRI, one of their primary breeding goals was to get apples, good tasting, marketable apples that had resistance to a fungal disease called apple scab, which in years like the one that we've had this year in Wausau, with lots and lots of rain and lots of humidity and lots of high heat, apple scab can wreak havoc on trees. It infects the leaves, and with enough scab lesions on the leaves, the tree can be completely defoliated by July or August. It also scars up the outside of the fruit. So for apple varieties that are susceptible to apple scab, it's almost impossible to grow marketable fruit without using chemical fungicides. So it was noticed that this Malus floribunda, which is a flowering crabapple, had resistance to apple scab. And if it had resistance, there had to be genetics for that resistance in the crabapple. So they chose to cross that with a cultivated apple called Rome Beauty back in 1945. When you cross that, you probably get a whole bunch of different apple trees. Some of them are going to be very much like crab apples. Some of them are going to be more like Rome Beauty. The first thing that you would do is harvest those seeds from a whole bunch of fruit, plant them out, let them grow to a year or two old, hit them intentionally with the apple scab fungus and see which ones survive, which ones show resistance. You can get rid of all the rest because they don't have your breeding goal. You let those remaining ones survive until they fruit, and you pick the best ones, and you harvest seed from those, and then you cross those with more desirable apple varieties. And so what you're trying to do through these 6 generations of crossing apples is to get rid of all of the undesirable in terms of eating quality, undesirable characteristics of the flowering crab, and breed in genetics from good eating apples so that you eventually wind up with a good eating apple that has that genetic resistance from the flowering crab. So it turns out it took 33 years from those first crosses until the seedling, the very first tree that eventually became known as Enterprise, came about. So it's a long process to do apple breeding because you can't do sex until you've got a reproductive plant, and you don't have a reproductive apple tree often until it's 5 to 7 years old, right? So every generation takes multiple years. So that first co-op seedling was recognized in 1978. That one tree had fruit that they thought was pretty tasty. It was a worthwhile tree. They had to test it in different areas. So they had to propagate it and grow it in different parts of the country, see that it performed well, get kind of grower and consumer feedback on it. And then once there was enough interest in that, then it had to be released to nurseries where they could grow enough trees to put it on the marketplace. So from that first cross in 1945, it was not commercially available for purchase until the mid-1990s. So almost 50 years later. So that's a very long process to bring an apple variety into production. Honeycrisp, many people's favorite apple these days, and often people are willing to pay a premium price for them. Turns out that it was almost discarded. The very first Honeycrisp apple tree resulted from a cross that happened in 1960 by the University of Minnesota. That tree was planted out along with a whole bunch of other seeds from this particular cross. And those trees were sitting there on an agricultural experiment station. They'd been tasted, tested, no real interest. And they were about to tear out all of those trees and get that land ready for another planting when one of the horticulturalists went out and said, well, let me do just one last evaluation. And he came across this tree and was like, wait a minute, this is a good one. We don't want to kill this one. So Honeycrisp was finally released to the marketplace in 1991. And then it takes time for the orchardists to purchase those trees and for the trees to come into bearing. So that was first available in stores in 1997. So that's kind of an interesting story that Honeycrisp, many people's favorite apple now, is almost discarded as no good. The genetic diversity that I talked about, this is a genetic map of Honeycrisp. And so if we go back to that previous picture, you can see a couple of the named apples in here. Probably the only one that many people are familiar with is Golden Delicious. Maybe you know Northern Spy. Maybe you know Keepsake. But the different colors on this represent genetic information from some of those different parents. The frostbite in green, the northern spy in orange and yellow, the golden delicious in kind of the red and crimson. And each one of these bars represents one of the chromosomes in a cell of a Honeycrisp apple tree. And so what you can see here is really that mixing, that combination of genetic material. And so imagine the same thing happening out in the wild, right? So this is the genetic diversity that exists. Here's an interesting figure. This is from Popular Science magazine, and they, interestingly enough, did an article on apple breeding. And I like this because it has a lot of familiar apple varieties on it. And so one of the things that you can see here, Golden Delicious, this circle in the middle represents kind of the genetic diversity, right? The pool of genetics in wild apple trees. And then we draw on that. Sometimes we get lucky, like Keepsake drew right out of that diversity. That was a seedling apple. The Granny Smith, the green arrow coming up on the top left. The Golden Delicious on the bottom left. Those are all just wild apple trees that somebody said, wow, look at that seedling, that's delicious. And it was propagated and marketed. Other ones like Honeycrisp, you can see those two last parents there of Keepsake, and Minnesota 627 gives us Honeycrisp. Some of you may have tasted Cosmic Crisp, a relatively new apple. I think that only appeared in the marketplace 2 years ago. Has Honeycrisp as one of its parents, and then my own backyard tree, Enterprise, as one of its other parents. So you can see this combination of wild apple sex in that circle in the middle, and then the intentional crosses that happen here. So biology doesn't stand still, and having 50 years to get a first cross to the marketplace is an awfully long time. Just as the human genome was sequenced in the late 1990s, the apple genome, meaning all of the genes, all of the DNA in an apple tree, was sequenced for the first time in 2017. And what that means is that now biologists and plant breeders can look into the DNA of a plant that they have, maybe even a seed or a seedling, and they can identify genes that might be desirable, genes that might be undesirable in terms of what their breeding goals are. And it's thought that this may really speed up apple breeding moving forward. So we may see a much faster appearance of new apple varieties on the marketplace. And so you can see what I've circled here on the right, maybe 2 years per cycle instead of the 5 to 7 years per cycle that happens in traditional breeding, right? Where you have to wait until the plant becomes reproductive and then cross it and then get fruit from it. All right, so that's wild apple sex and controlled apple sex. The third way that we get good apples can be from mutations. Mutations that happen not as part of sexual reproduction, but as part of growth. And so one thing that's important to understand about the way that plants grow is that branches get longer, stems get longer by just a little zone of cell division right at the tip of every branch. And that zone is what we call a meristem. That's where all of the cell division happens. And so if a mutation were to happen, if a change in the DNA, change in the genetics were to happen just by accident, right? And you might think of this as like every time a cell has to divide, it has to copy its DNA and then divide that DNA into two identical cells. Just like, you know, taking a handout and making it on the copier and then making a copy of the copy and then making a copy of the copy, you're gradually going to accumulate some dirt and some fuzz and some spots and that kind of thing. Occasionally a mistake will happen in the copying of the DNA when cells divide. And then all of the rest of that branch, from that point onward, as that branch grows, has that new genetics. And so that new genetics might show up in different fruit characteristics, different shape, different color, a little different taste, different growth forms of the branches. A whole variety of characteristics might change depending on what gene develops. So it turns out that about 30% of the apple varieties, the named kinds of apples that are grown in agriculture, arose as sports. So not through wild apple sex, not through controlled plant breeding sex, but just through these random genetic accidents. And you can see about a half of global apple production is a result of these kinds of apple varieties. So with red delicious apples, very few people these days, I think, would say that a red delicious apple is delicious, especially in comparison to many of the other apples that are on the marketplace. A lot of orchardists, commercial orchardists, are taking out their red delicious apple trees if they still have them and replacing them with newer varieties. I would love to have an apple from one of the original strains of Red Delicious because apparently it was an extraordinarily tasty apple. But the orchardists picked sports of Red Delicious that looked nicer, that had deeper color, that had more crimson, that had fewer spots on them. And so over time, they were choosing primarily for visual appearance of the fruit and lost the interest or lost the focus on flavor. So Red Delicious changed and became more and more attractive over time, but less and less tasty over time as a result of these sports. Johnny Gold apple may have originated as a sport. And if you're a gardener and you get seed catalogs, you may have seen what you see here in the middle picture, columnar apple trees. So apple trees where there really is not a lot of horizontal branching, but a very tall, upright, skinny tree with short branches. That also is thought to have originated as a sport. So a mutation that didn't really change the fruiting characteristic, but changed the growth form of the tree. So that's kind of a third way that genetic diversity in apples can come about. This figure shows Gala apples. Some people really, really love Galas. That's a tasty apple. The original Gala is there on the top right, but there are lots of named variations of Gala, and you can see it's subtle, right? It's subtle, but you can see a little bit different shapes, different colors, different speckling and streaking patterns, and presumably maybe some changes in flavor as well with all of these different varieties of Gala. So the thing is, you might go to the store and be buying a Buckeye apple, but the orchardist is marketing it as Gala because that has the name recognition, right? So then if Buckeye doesn't taste as good as Gala, you might say, oh, Galas just don't taste as good as they used to. And it's not the Gala, it's the Buckeye that's being marketed as a Gala apple. All right, so if we have one tree, that one enterprise tree, after 50 years or 33 years of breeding and crossing, and we get one tree that has fruit that we like, how do we get nurseries full? How do we get orchards full? How do we get lots and lots of enterprise apple trees or Honeycrisp or Johnny Gold or whatever it might be? Well, we can't take seeds out of there because those apple flowers will cross-pollinate, and every seed in that Golden Delicious or Enterprise or Honeycrisp apple is genetically different. So we have to do a technique called grafting. Grafting is really common in woody plant agriculture. Almost all of our citrus fruits, oranges, lemons, grapefruits, almost all of our stone fruits like cherries, plums, apricots, peaches, and almost all of our apples and pears originate from grafting. So in grafting, what you're doing is taking a piece of a stick from the tree that has the fruiting characteristics that you want and joining that to a rooted stem, what we call the rootstock. And you can see on this figure there are lots of ways of doing that. You can match little pencil diameter pieces together, as you see here on the top right, using a tongue and whip graft. You can take an existing tree or a branch of an existing tree and lop it off and put your little pencil-sized stick underneath the bark of that. This is a way that you can get one apple tree in your backyard to have 3, 5, 7, I think I've heard as many as 27 varieties of apples growing on a single tree by grafting. 27 is excessive. I had one tree that I think had 5 varieties on it by doing this technique. So that's something that you can do in your own backyard if you have one tree and you want to try something out. So grafting is an important technique. It turns out that grafting, we have evidence that the Babylonians invented grafting about 3,800 years ago. So about 1800 BC, the Babylonians had already figured out how to do grafting. The Roman Empire were moving apples around because the Roman Empire was at the end of that trade route through the Tian Shan. So the Romans moved grafted apples around and up into Europe. So grafting's been around for a really long time, but that's how we get orchards full of apples that are genetically uniform. One of the things that we do with apples when we do grafting is we have a choice of what rootstock to put them on. And rootstocks vary greatly. So rootstocks can come about through plant sex or through plant breeding, and we can have rootstocks that will lead to really, really small trees, what we call dwarf or super dwarf trees. And on the figure here at the bottom left, you can see some named rootstocks that will create trees that are maybe only a third the size of a standard seedling apple tree, or you can anywhere in between. So rootstocks are used in horticulture to regulate the size of apple trees. It also influences how soon an apple tree will come into production and start bearing fruit. So a dwarf tree might start to bear fruit in as little as 2 to 3 years after you plant it, whereas a seedling apple tree or an apple grafted onto a seedling rootstock might take as many as 7 or 8 years to come into bearing. The seedling tree is going to be big, it's going to be longer lived, it won't need staking or trellising to hold it up, but it's a lot harder to pick from, it's a lot harder to prune, it's a lot harder to get good spray coverage if you're going to spray your trees. So there are some pros and cons. The really small trees, they tend to need trellises and are relatively short-lived, but they're going to come into production sooner, and they'll be much easier to pick and prune and get good spray coverage so that you get good fruit qualities. So the rootstocks can affect size, but they can also affect adaptation to soil type. Is it heavy soil or sandy soil? Is it wet soil, dry soil? And even resistance to certain insects and diseases that attack apples. The resistance in the fruiting part that grows from the scion, the stick of the apple type that you wanted, that can be influenced by the rootstock as well. So the fruit quality, the fruit type will be determined by the scion, but many other aspects of the tree will be determined by the rootstock. So this picture gives you a sense of what a standard seedling apple rootstock or a mature apple tree would look like. Nothing here for scale, but you would clearly need a ladder to do harvesting, to do pruning, and that dense canopy would be really difficult to get sunlight penetration into for good plant growth and fruiting characteristics, and also difficult to get spray residue into. In contrast, most modern orchards are using very dwarfing trees planted very close together. I mean, you can have thousands of apple trees per acre in these really high density plantings. The trees might be as close together as a foot apart, which is pretty amazing. But they need expensive trellising, they need good weed control, they need irrigation. So it's a very high maintenance, high expense way of growing apple trees. And these trees will be relatively short-lived. But the return on investment comes much more quickly with this type of system. Okay, so a little bit about, so that's where apples come from in sort of the big sense. Like, where do we get Honeycrisp? Where do we get Cosmic Crisp? Where do we get Gala from? How do we get good apples, good Honeycrisp apples, or good Gala apples 12 months of the year here in Wisconsin or wherever we live? Well, it turns out that apples are what's called a climacteric fruit. And what this means is, in much the same way that you can pick a green tomato and bring it in on your counter and it will ripen on the counter, apples are the same way. Bananas are the same way, right? You go to the store and you buy a bunch of bananas that look like these green ones on the left, and if you leave them on your counter, they will gradually turn from starchy, green and hard, to soft, sweet, aromatic yellow with the black spots. Pears, the same way. Pears, much harder and greener in the top picture, and you can see that much more golden color in the bottom picture. Sweet, aromatic, soft, ripe fruit. So apples continue to ripen after harvest like these other fruits do. And that ripening is influenced by temperature. The warmer it is, the faster they'll ripen. There's a gas that plant parts especially fruits, will produce called ethylene. And ethylene is a gas associated with ripening apples or with damaged tissues, and that speeds up ripening as well. The ripening is a metabolic activity, meaning the cells, the tissues of that apple, they're still alive. They're still doing things, and they need cellular respiration for that to happen. Cellular respiration requires oxygen. So the presence of oxygen is needed for this after ripening. And there are some enzymes that are happening in here as well. The enzymes that break apart starch and the enzymes that soften up the cell walls that make like a hard pear into a soft pear or a hard green tomato into a soft ripe tomato. So all of these things influence that ripening that happens after harvest. So if we want to get fresh, crisp apples in the supermarket year round, there are 4 ways to do that, right? Based on the fact that apples are climacteric, that they'll continue to ripen, what we can do is harvest apples before they're fully ripe, because if they're fully ripe, they're going to be softer and more likely to get damaged. So we can harvest them while they're firm and still crisp and not fully ripe, not fully tasty, and then put them into cold storage. So really large walk-in coolers, drop the temperature down to like maybe 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and we can store the apples there for a really long time. That will slow the ripening and the softening process. And then when you're ready to market them, you can bring them out of that cold storage and sell them to consumers. Even better, and a little bit more expensive, is to put apples in controlled atmospheric storage. So this is the same big refrigerator, but there's a gas exchange system that basically almost eliminates oxygen from that refrigerated space, and that slows the metabolism of the apples even further. So you can keep apples in controlled atmosphere storage for probably 10 months after harvest and pull them out, and they will still be quite good, quite crisp, quite tasty. And then the third option is, because winter or springtime in Wisconsin is fall in Argentina or New Zealand or Australia, we can ship fresh picked apples from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, and we can have fresh picked apples in the springtime, and vice versa, right? We can ship apples from North America or from Europe down to the southern hemisphere, and they can have ripe apples fresh picked in the summertime. The fourth option is to breed apples that don't soften very much after harvest. And that turns out to be a technique that is increasing in frequency. So non-softening apples that we can pick them, they won't get soft, so they won't get bruised, they won't get damaged, they won't start to rot in shipping and storage and moving from the orchard to the wholesaler cross country in a truck into the supermarket and then to the consumer's house. They'll be hard, crisp apples that just won't get damaged, and they'll have that nice, sweet, crisp flavor. So Thoreau again, not a big fan of cultivated apples. So this quote, he says, "Apples for grafting appear to have been selected commonly, not so much for their spirited flavor as for their mildness, their size, their bearing qualities. Not so much for their beauty as for their fairness and soundness." Remember the selection for Red Delicious, right? "I have no faith in these selected lists of pomological gentlemen," meaning apple growers. "Their favorites and none suches, and seek no furthers, when I have fruited them, commonly turn out to be very tame and forgettable. They're eaten with comparatively little zest and have no real tang or smack to them." Love that. Thoreau is such a great writer. So let's jump forward about 130 years. Frank Browning was an orchardist from Missouri, and he's written extensively on apples as well. He's got a great book that's just called Apples. And he says the emergence of a global trade in apples, as in other commodities, meaning things where they're not named, you don't know their provenance, you don't know where they came from, like navel oranges, right? Navel orange is a navel orange, you don't know really where it came from, you don't know who the grower was. If you find a really good one, you're hard-pressed to get another really good one like that because you really don't know where it came from. You can't support a good grower. The search for new fruit has been limited to very few criteria. Hard, pretty fruit that hold their crispness for a week at room temperature. These commodity-driven criteria have impoverished the entire American food supply and have produced ordinary, uninteresting apples that simply can't compete with the high salt, high fat, high sugar, high packaged items that have saturated the snack food market. So Browning and Thoreau both would probably not be huge fans of things like Gala and some of the other apples that have made it onto the marketplace. So there are some other things that are happening. So Honeycrisp, it turns out that you have to be a really good apple grower to grow a Honeycrisp apple. Not all Honeycrisps are equally awesome. And so what's happening now is new varieties of apples, because the time and expense of developing them require growers to be part of a club, right? They buy into a club. Only a limited number of apple growers can grow that kind of apple, and that provides some economic incentive to those growers, economic benefits, right? You get quality control. The apples are going to stay good because very few growers are growing them. They're all growing them according to some same standards. And those new apples that generate consumer interest can stay expensive for a long time and generate lots of return for those orchardists. So that is that's my bit on apples. Just a couple of things on cider, and then we'll wrap up. Often I get questions: what is cider? What is apple juice? And so in this picture, you might quickly guess that the one on the left is cider and the one on the right is juice, but in fact the label says exactly the opposite. Cider, juice, Americans, we'll put name on like a gas station sugary caffeinated drink and call it cappuccino. It's certainly not cappuccino, right? So cider and juice are used interchangeably. Primarily, I think juice is filtered and cider is not filtered. In the rest of the world, cider means fermented, alcoholic, and juice means not fermented. I'll skip over that one for now. Most commercial ciders, a lot of people, hard cider is making a comeback, and a lot of the commercial ciders are sweetened for the American taste. So this Stella Artois cider from Europe has some large number of carbs of grams of carbohydrates in it, 22 grams. It's very sweet. It's almost like an alcoholic apple soda is the way that I picture it. When I ferment cider at home, I don't add any sweetener to it. So it's very dry, it's very fizzy. It still retains that essence of apple. It's really nice. And that's coming back. So as people start consuming cider, there are some more craft ciders coming out that are not quite so sweetened. And intriguingly, we have our first cider pub in Wisconsin down in Mount Horeb. I've not been there yet, but they've got a great website. Bricks Cider is their name. So I'll wrap it up there and take any questions that people have. Let me just skip ahead to Wausau. We're almost to that time in Wisconsin when it's cold and people might go out and celebrate their apple tree. Here's to the old apple tree that blooms well, bears well, hats full, caps full, 3 bushel bags full, and all under one tree. Huzzah, huzzah. And some sources, if you're interested in more, I'll leave these up. Frank Browning's book is great, very easy read, interesting. Michael Pollan's book, about a quarter of it is on apples, and Johnny Appleseed. And then some of the other sources on here might be interesting as well. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to seeing what questions and comments have come in.
Yeah, well, that was great. Let's see. I'll turn my microphone. Well, probably can hear me all right. Yeah, I can see. Okay. We didn't have a whole lot of questions, but again, people are watching live. Feel free to drop them, now that we've reached the end. I guess something that I thought was kind of interesting, or a question, and maybe you could speak to more. Obviously the names give recognition and everything. Is how do you come up with names? Is that because obviously there's you talked about how this might be marketed as a Gala apple, but it's something else. Mm-hmm. Is there any way of regulating that, or is it just kind of up to the apple growers to decide to say this is what this is or that?
Yeah, so the very first name, so like Honeycrisp, mm-hmm. was part of University of Minnesota's breeding program, and that breeding program in the university generates revenue by selling that germplasm, that named apple.
Oh, sure.
So they want to have a catchy name, right? So they sort of have their marketing people come up with a name, and Honeycrisp, like honey is sweet, yummy, good, crisp, yes, mm-hmm. that sounds appealing. So they come up with that name. And then that apple gets propagated by nurseries and gets put out on the marketplace, and you get the buzz. So there's value in that name, right? You build a clientele, and people get excited about that apple, and they seek it out by name. And then over time, as sports begin to develop, I think the thought is that this sport it's originated from that original apple that had a name, but it's kind of a new and improved version of it. It wasn't the result of plant breeding, so we can go ahead and still market it under that familiar name.
Sure.
It's kind of a new and improved, more attractive, maybe it will increase sales version of that. And I think that the experience of Red Delicious really declining in eating quality over the years as more and more selection happened for visual appearance. I mean, if you think about sort of the stereotypical clip art of an apple, that's golden. I mean, that's Red Delicious, right?
Yeah.
So that's, people pick their apples based on appearance often. Oh, that one's redder, that's got to be more tasty, right? So there's value in that. There are apple marketing boards and apple grower associations and that kind of thing, but I think I don't know that there's a way of regulating using a name for an apple that's not that apple, unless it's still under a patent, still under a trademark.
Sure, patent, yeah. I suppose that only goes to the country that you're growing them in, and
Exactly.
Somebody in a different country says, I'm just going to call it this. There's no way of...
put it in a different language, and
Yeah,
who knows, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I guess and the other thing was obviously a lot of the stuff that you were talking about was developed in universities in the United States. Is that still typically where you see a lot of the development? Is that kind of the main thing, or? Yeah,
so a lot of universities have gotten out of breeding woody plants like apples because of the expense and the time frame. There's sort of faster the publisher parish mentality in research and in grant writing wants a fast turnaround to get results. And so waiting 5 to 7 years per generation and multiple generations, that ties up a lot of land and a lot of personnel in a very long-term breeding project. And relatively little return on investment, because once that apple is produced, you can patent it for a while, but then eventually people can start grafting it. Once the patent runs out, they can start grafting it on their own. So there's a really limited window for making money back on that really long investment of plant breeding.
Sure.
So there are many fewer, like that PRI, Purdue Rutgers Illinois breeding program no longer exists as a collaborative breeding project. But most apple breeding is still done in a few university programs. And often it might be like apple growers or apple marketing associations that are helping to support that breeding work.
Okay, sure.
And certainly like the wild apple sex that's going on, and home growers that have some space to grow a bunch of apple trees, they can still do breeding on their own. But I'm not aware of any like amateur breeders that have brought marketable apples to the marketplace.
Okay.
Yeah, but definitely a lot fewer breeding programs for apples now than there have been in, say, most of the 20th century.
And it isn't most of the 20th century when you see that?
Yeah.
This isn't, people aren't in the 1800s going around and breeding for that.
Yeah,
it seems like a very 20th century sort of mentality.
Yeah. I think a lot of I don't know about any breeding that happened for apples in the 1800s. A lot of I think the Granny Smith originated in the 1800s. The Red Delicious and the Golden Delicious did, but all of those were chance seedlings that were discovered.
Sure, yeah.
I think the breeding, and it might have to do with, plant breeding and animal breeding goes back several centuries at least. But Gregor Mendel's work on genetics, that was published for the first time in the late 1850s, but it really wasn't widely recognized until the early 1900s. So sort of the genetic mechanism for inheritance was not widely known until the early 20th century.
There's certainly people trying to harness that for making better apples and what have you.
Right, so selection, yes, but in terms of like intentionally taking pollen from one and putting it on another and then growing them out and repeating that process, that's definitely a 20th century phenomenon.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, I think people don't seem to have any questions here, so I think we will maybe call it there.
Sounds great.
Thanks again, Paul, for sharing your love of apples, and it's a great presentation. Certainly learned a lot about things that most of us probably don't even think about when we go to the supermarket and see all the different varieties.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think you take some things for granted until it's called to your attention. And so going through a produce department and like, here's carrots, here's celery, here's cucumbers, and here's 10 different kinds of apples. Like, what?
Yeah.
So I think that may take people by surprise. Apples are a really intriguing fruit with a lot of really interesting stories to tell. So I hope that's what people got out of today.
Yeah, hopefully. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and yeah, we'll see you.